you'd probably never eat a beetle off the ground. Here's the uncomfortable part. That same beetle is packed with more protein per gram than beef, contains no bacteria risk a bird can't handle in seconds, and your own ancestors ate them constantly. The reason you won't touch one has almost nothing to do with safety, or taste, or nutrition. So let's actually ask the question properly. Why does a bird casually snatching a grub off the ground register as completely normal, unremarkable, even wholesome, while the idea of a human doing the exact same thing triggers instant visceral disgust? Because the honest answer isn't that insects are somehow unsafe or nutritionally inferior for humans specifically. It's that somewhere in the last few centuries, an entire category of food that humans ate for the overwhelming majority of our species' existence got quietly, culturally erased from the menu, and most people never even realized it happened. Let's start with the nutritional case, because this is where the popular assumption falls apart fastest. Insects are, gram for gram, genuinely impressive as a food source. Crickets, for example, contain roughly the same protein content per gram as beef, sometimes higher depending on species and preparation, while requiring dramatically less water, land, and feed to produce the same amount of usable protein. Many edible insect species are also rich in healthy fats, iron, zinc, and vitamin B12, nutrients that plant-based diets often specifically struggle to provide in sufficient quantities. This isn't a fringe claim from insect-eating enthusiasts. Researchers studying alternative protein sources have consistently found that a wide range of edible insects meet or exceed the nutritional profile of conventional livestock across multiple key metrics, which raises an obvious question. If insects are genuinely this nutritionally solid, why did an entire category of food essentially disappear from Western diets specifically, while remaining completely normal across large parts of the world? Birds offer a useful starting comparison here because their relationship with insects reveals something important about digestion that applies to humans too, just in a less obvious way. Many bird species have digestive systems specifically adapted to process chitin, the tough material that makes up an insect's exoskeleton, breaking it down efficiently using specialized enzymes and a highly acidic digestive environment. Humans, it turns out, aren't nearly as poorly equipped for this as popular assumption suggests. Human stomach acid is genuinely capable of breaking down chitin to a meaningful degree, and while humans lack some of the specific enzymes birds use for maximally efficient chitin digestion, this simply means insects require the same basic preparation most other foods do: cooking, grinding, or processing, rather than representing some fundamental biological incompatibility. In other words, the gap between a bird safely eating a beetle and a human safely eating that same beetle is considerably smaller than most people assume, more a matter of preparation than fundamental biological limitation. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because humans didn't always avoid insects the way most Western cultures do today. The archaeological and anthropological evidence for historical human insect consumption, technically called entomophagy, is extensive and stretches back deep into our evolutionary history. Comparative studies of contemporary great apes, particularly chimpanzees, document extensive and sophisticated insect foraging behavior, including the deliberate use of tools to extract termites and ants from their nests, suggesting insect consumption was almost certainly a consistent, reliable part of the diet for our hominin ancestors as well, long before modern humans existed. Termites, ants, grubs, and various beetle larvae would have represented an extremely accessible, year-round, and calorically dense food source requiring relatively modest foraging effort for a substantial nutritional return, precisely the kind of low-risk, high-reward food category that early hominin diets appear to have relied on heavily. It's worth dwelling on the termite and ant evidence specifically because researchers studying chimpanzee tool use have documented behavior remarkably sophisticated for what most people would assume is a simple foraging task. Chimpanzees strip leaves from thin branches to create specialized probing tools, insert them carefully into termite mounds, wait, and extract them covered in termites to eat. A learned behavior passed down through observation across generations within specific chimpanzee communities, essentially a genuine, if simple, cultural tradition. If our closest living relatives display this level of dedicated behavioral investment in extracting insects specifically, it strongly suggests early hominins, who shared a relatively recent common ancestor with chimpanzees and possessed at least comparable cognitive and manual dexterity, were almost certainly engaging in similarly deliberate, skilled insect foraging. Not as a desperate last resort, but as a genuinely reliable, actively pursued food strategy. This pattern didn't stop with early hominins either. Insect consumption remained a normal, unremarkable part of human diets across an enormous range of cultures well into recorded history, history, and in many parts of the world, it never stopped at all. Insects remain a completely conventional food source today across large parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, prepared in countless traditional ways. Roasted, fried, ground into flour, incorporated into sauces and everyday dishes, with absolutely none of the disgust response that characterizes much of Western food culture. In Thailand, for instance, fried crickets and various grub species are sold as common street food, prepared with the same casual, everyday normalcy as any other snack food. In parts of Mexico, chapulines, seasoned and roasted grasshoppers, have been consumed as a traditional dish for centuries, remaining a genuinely popular, actively sought-after food today, rather than some fading historical relic. In several African countries, mopane worms, actually the caterpillar larvae of a specific moth species, represent a significant, valued source of dietary protein, harvested seasonally and prepared through drying, frying, or stewing depending on regional tradition. None of these represent survival food or last resort eating. In each of these food cultures, insects occupy a completely normal, sometimes genuinely prized, position within everyday and even celebratory cuisine. There's a particularly interesting case study worth examining, specifically the silkworm pupa, because it illustrates just how deeply insect eating can be woven into a food culture as a genuine, mainstream comfort food rather than a novelty. In South Korea, boiled and seasoned silkworm pupae, known as baeondegi, are sold as an extremely common street food and snack, available in convenience stores and street vendors across the country with the same casual accessibility as any other packaged snack. Baeondegi didn't emerge as some kind of desperate wartime substitute food, though its popularity did increase during periods of scarcity. It has remained a genuinely enjoyed, actively chosen snack food for generations since, appearing in casual conversation, popular media, and everyday food culture with none of the shock value framing it would carry in most Western contexts. Mealworms represent another particularly well-studied case from a nutritional science perspective specifically, with researchers finding that mealworm protein compares remarkably favorably to conventional meat sources across multiple nutritional benchmarks, while mealworm farming operations have been established specifically to supply the growing alternative protein and pet food industries in several Western countries, often marketed to consumers who would likely feel considerable hesitation eating the same insect in a more recognizable, whole form. Researchers studying global dietary patterns estimate that well over 2 billion people worldwide regularly consume insects as a completely normal part of their diet today, which means the Western aversion to insect eating isn't some universal human default. It's a specific cultural pattern, geographically and historically bounded, not a species-wide biological or psychological given. So if insects were a normal, reliable food source for most of human history and remain completely normal for a majority of the world's population today, what actually happened in the specific regions where this aversion took hold? The honest answer involves a combination of agricultural development, economic factors, and a genuinely fascinating psychological mechanism researchers call disgust conditioning. As agriculture developed and certain regions transitioned toward livestock-based protein sources, insects gradually lost their practical necessity as a primary food source in those specific areas. Not because they became less nutritious or less safe, but because alternative protein sources became more reliably available and more deeply woven into emerging agricultural economies and food traditions. Once a food source stops being a practical necessity within a given culture, it becomes genuinely vulnerable to being reclassified, sometimes across just a few generations, from ordinary food into something considered unclean, primitive, or beneath the emerging cultural standard, particularly as that culture develops increasing contact with and often increasing cultural anxiety about differentiating itself from other groups who continued eating insects as a matter of course. This is where the psychology of disgust becomes genuinely important to understand, because disgust, unlike many other emotional responses, is heavily learned and culturally transmitted rather than being a fixed, universal biological reaction to specific foods. Researchers studying disgust psychology have found that the specific foods a culture considers disgusting versus delicious vary enormously across the world, and are shaped substantially by childhood exposure, social modeling, and repeated cultural reinforcement rather than any consistent, universal biological signal about what's actually safe or nutritious to eat. A child raised in a culture where insects are a completely normal food will feel no more disgust eating a fried cricket than a Western child feels eating a shrimp. Itself, worth noting, essentially a distant crustacean relative of insects that Western cultures have no trouble eating at all. The disgust response isn't tracking some deep biological truth about insect safety. It's tracking cultural familiarity, which is precisely why that response can vary so dramatically across different populations eating objectively similar foods. There's a specific comparison worth pulling out here because it illustrates just how arbitrary this cultural line actually is once you examine it closely. Shrimp, lobster, and crab, foods widely considered delicacies across much of the Western world, are all crustaceans, arthropods closely related to insects, sharing the same basic biological classification, exoskeletons made of the same chitin material, and broadly similar nutritional profiles. There is no meaningful biological reason why a culture would consider a lobster a luxury food while considering a cricket repulsive, beyond the specific historical and cultural pathway that happened to elevate one arthropod category while excluding the other. This inconsistency, prized when it comes from the ocean, rejected when it comes from land, reveals just how much of this reaction is built entirely on cultural categorization rather than any consistent underlying logic about safety, nutrition, or even the animal's basic biological classification. There's also a genuinely important historical wrinkle worth mentioning here, because the Western aversion to insects wasn't always as absolute as it appears today, and even within Western history, the line has shifted meaningfully over time. Some historical European sources document insect consumption, particularly of certain grubs and larvae, occurring with considerably less stigma in earlier centuries than became standard later on. Researchers studying the history of Western food taboos have pointed to increasing urbanization, industrialized food production, and shifting class-based food signaling, certain foods becoming associated with poverty or rural life and therefore avoided by increasingly urban, status-conscious populations as contributing factors in how firmly this particular disgust response eventually calcified into what many people today mistake for a natural, unchangeable human reaction rather than a comparatively recent cultural development. It's worth addressing directly why this matters beyond simple historical curiosity, because insect consumption has increasingly become a genuinely serious topic in modern nutritional and environmental science, not just a curiosity about ancient diets. Researchers studying sustainable protein production have consistently found that insect farming requires dramatically less land, water, and feed input compared to conventional livestock farming, while producing substantially lower greenhouse gas emissions per gram of usable protein. Specifically, studies comparing cricket farming to conventional cattle farming have found insect protein production can require a small fraction of the land and water input for a comparable amount of usable protein, an efficiency gap significant enough that it's difficult to overstate its potential relevance to future food security planning. As global population growth and climate pressures continue to strain conventional agricultural systems, several researchers and food scientists have specifically pointed to insects as one of the most promising underutilized solutions to a genuinely difficult modern food security and sustainability problem, one that a large portion of the world's population is, in a very real sense, already quietly solving through existing dietary traditions that Western food culture happened to abandon for reasons that had little to do with actual nutritional or environmental logic. There's also a genuinely interesting modern counter-movement worth mentioning here, because Western attitudes toward insect consumption have begun shifting meaningfully in recent years, even if slowly. Cricket flour, insect-based protein bars, and various novelty insect food products have gained a genuine, if still niche, foothold in several Western markets, often marketed specifically around their nutritional efficiency and environmental sustainability, rather than any attempt to directly replicate traditional whole insect dishes. This gradual reintroduction follows a genuinely familiar cultural pattern. Foods often re-enter a culture's acceptable diet more easily when reframed or repackaged in an unfamiliar-seeming format. Ground into flour, incorporated into a protein bar, rather than presented in a form that too directly triggers the specific learned disgust response associated with the food's original whole appearance. Several countries within the European Union have also begun formally approving specific insect species for commercial food production and sale in recent years, a genuinely significant regulatory shift that would have seemed almost unthinkable within mainstream Western food policy just a few decades earlier, suggesting the cultural line, while still firmly in place for most people today, may not be nearly as permanently fixed as it currently feels. So the picture that emerges here isn't really about insects being fundamentally unsafe, nutritionally inferior, or biologically incompatible with human digestion in some meaningful way that birds and 2 billion humans worldwide have simply managed to overcome. It's about an extraordinarily specific cultural pathway, one where certain regions, as they developed alternative protein sources through agriculture and livestock farming, gradually reclassified an entire category of food from ordinary to repulsive, not through any careful evaluation of safety or nutrition, but through a slow accumulation of cultural distancing, economic shift, and generational disgust conditioning that eventually became so deeply embedded it started to feel like an obvious, natural, universal human reaction, rather than the specific, geographically bounded cultural artifact it actually is. So the next time you watch a bird casually eat a bug off your lawn without a second thought, it's worth remembering that the difference between that bird and you isn't really about biology, safety, or nutrition at all. It's a difference in cultural history, one specific enough that if you'd been born in a different part of the world, or a few centuries earlier in your own, you'd likely be eating that same beetle without a second thought either, and finding the idea of avoiding it, not the idea of eating it, to be the genuinely strange choice. Somewhere out there, right now, over 2 billion people are proving exactly that, one completely ordinary meal at a time.